Thanks to you at home for joining us this hour. Today, as the Bahamas announced that the death toll from Hurricane Dorian has climbed in the Bahamas from 5 as of this weekend to 7 as of last night to 20 as of tonight. With the increasingly clear views we are getting of the overwhelming devastation in certain islands in the Bahamas, making it all but a certainty that that death toll will climb even higher than the 20 killed that was described tonight by the Bahamian Prime Minister. Tonight, with that same storm now gaining strength again as it zeroes in on the southeastern United States, with both hurricane warnings and storm surge warnings in parts of Florida and Georgia and the Carolinas and Virginia tonight. Today, the U.S. government, in the midst of that, stumbled into a situation that we've never seen before. Honestly, we've never seen anything even remotely like this before. I mean, this is usually the time in the show where I would try to come up with some sort of clever story to lead up to this, right? Like maybe a little historical anecdote to put it in perspective, to help us all understand what happened, what it means today that this strange thing happened, right? I tried to show one of the other times that a U.S. president has done something a little bit like this. That's usually what I would do at this point in the show. I cannot do that tonight, because the U.S. president has never before done a thing even remotely like what President Trump did tonight in the context of this storm. And so I don't even know what would count as relevant historical context here if I tried to make up that story. So we just got to take it at face value and try to assess how we deal with this coming from the top of the federal government now. Because today, the President of the United States did what he called a hurricane update. The official White House Twitter account posted a video of what the president did tonight and captioned it as "President Trump gives an update on Hurricane Dorian." Except what the president held up for display to the country in his update on Hurricane Dorian was a map that appears to have started out as a real map made by the National Hurricane Center, made by the National Weather Service. And you can see it started off as a real map. You see up in the left-hand corner, NOAA, that's the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. That's the overall agency. Then you see the headline at the top, Hurricane Dorian Forecast Track and Intensity. That's the kind of headline you see on documents like this from the National Weather Service. Then you get the information in the caption there. Again, in this document that the president held up. NWS, National Weather Service, National Hurricane Center. So the president, with this thing on poster board in the Oval Office, he appears to be presenting real U.S. government information to the public in this self-proclaimed update on Hurricane Dorian from President Trump in the Oval Office. Except what the president is holding up is false information, right? It's an altered hurricane map. The little semicircle in black Sharpie that's on the map there, that was added to the map. That was not put there by the National Weather Service. That's not something the National Hurricane Center did. And actually, according to Bloomberg News today, that little bit was added to the map by President Trump personally, by the president himself. Bloomberg News today citing sources saying that the president is the one who drew on this map and changed it and then displayed it to the American people as if this was Hurricane Dorian's track. That's how Bloomberg has it. According to CNN tonight, it was some other official besides the president who drew on the map before the president held it up. I mean, in either case, this is not the work of the National Weather Service. This is not the work of the National Hurricane Center, right? Showing the track, like heading up through Florida and then bloop over to Alabama. That's not what the National Weather Service says now or ever said the hurricane was going to do. And while the words of this president are no longer expected, I think, in any quarter, to have necessary connection to the truth, I mean, it's a fact about this administration that nobody expects anymore that statements from this president will be things that are true. This is actually not him just saying a thing. This is him doing a thing. This is him announcing to the American people that he's got an update for the American public on the hurricane. And this is his update. This is him in the middle of a large hurricane bearing down on the United States, holding up a doctored map that, for whatever reason, conveys false information about the track of that storm to us, the American people, who are currently in the midst of trying to figure out how best to prepare for that storm's impact. The president's giving the country false information about where the storm might be heading. And honestly, what's the cure for that? How do you undo that level of irresponsibility when it's coming from the head of the government in a constant flow? I mean, I don't know if something started at the G7 conference that maybe rattled something a little bit loose, but something is going wrong right now. More wrong than it has been previously. It's going wrong at a bad time and in a bad way. I mean, you will remember, the president was supposed to go to Poland this past weekend, right? To commemorate the start of World War II 80 years ago this week. He canceled that trip at the last minute, so, according to the White House, he could spend every minute of the holiday weekend monitoring Hurricane Dorian and leading the national response to Hurricane Dorian. The president then spent 2 days of the weekend golfing at his golf courses. Well, since he canceled his trip to Poland to instead stay home and golf/lead the hurricane response, the president was, unsurprisingly, asked by reporters if he had any message he wanted to convey to the people of Poland, since he'd had to cancel his trip. His trip, again, which was to commemorate Poland being invaded by Nazi Germany to start World War II. Asked if he had anything to say to the people of Poland on that somber, tragic commemoration date, the president's answer was, quote, "I just want to congratulate Poland. It's a great country." I mean, it's not like he was being asked a trivia question about Poland. He was being asked about him having canceled his trip to Poland to commemorate the start of World War II. Congratulations, Poland. The president then insisted that he's never heard of a Category 5 hurricane, and the experts have never seen anything like it. It's brand new. This is actually the fourth Category 5 hurricane to threaten the United States just since he's been president. How is it that he thinks he's never heard of a Category 5 hurricane? And the general, I think, well-earned and appropriate response to this kind of inane, muddled absurdity from the White House and from the president in particular has basically been to tune it out, right? Seek real information elsewhere. Wait for this all to just pass. And yes, I think that's true, and that's warranted on normal subjects and on normal days. But this really is a life-threatening emergency. I mean, it's literally an emergency. A formally declared emergency, although the president is making stuff up about that, too. Under U.S. federal law, if a state wants to ask for a federal emergency declaration, that request has to be made to the federal government by the top elected official in the state. The request specifically has to come from the governor of the state by law. In the state of North Carolina, the governor is a Democrat, Roy Cooper. And his party affiliation is something that should not matter at all when there is a hurricane looming off the coast of his state. But it was Democratic Governor Roy Cooper who, on Monday, made the formal request to the federal government to declare an emergency in North Carolina ahead of this oncoming storm. It had to be him who made the request. That's the law. The governor is the only public official who can make that request. But the White House, the president himself, even decided to lie about that, stating instead that the federal government was making this declaration of an emergency in North Carolina at the request of not the Democratic governor there, but instead at the request of one of the state's Republican U.S. senators, who happens to be up for re-election next year. The White House saying that that Republican senator is the one who requested the emergency declaration from the federal government, and so that's why it was granted. I mean, I guess they're hoping that lie will help that Republican senator back home in North Carolina. That'll help him get reelected. But it is a lie. And, it means they're lying about a federally declared emergency. If you lie about that, one of the adages about character, right, is that you shouldn't trust a person who shows no compunction about lying about little things. Because even if those little things aren't themselves important, having no compunction about lying about little things is a pretty good indication that that person would be comfortable lying about big things too, right? That's like a basic character lesson that you learn from, fables that are read to you before you go to preschool. How do we adapt that as American citizens now to a situation where somebody in a very important position of responsibility is plainly comfortable lying even about life-threatening Category 5 hurricane emergencies, right? It's just this is a kind of situation we've just never, ever, ever, ever been in before. And so we don't have rules. We don't even have casual rules of thumb for how you deal with something like this, for how you make it right. I mean, in some cases, the criminal law might help in a couple of ways. In the middle of all the lying about the weather over the last few days, White House staffers also quietly admitted to reporters from CNN that the president was also lying last week when he said publicly that his administration had received phone calls from the Chinese government, very good phone calls, he called them, asking to reopen trade talks between China and the United States. This is one of those little what's the president talking about moments from last week's news. What was that all about anyway? Well, it turns out, according to White House officials, the president was lying about those supposed calls from the Chinese government. And this one comes with a nice kicker. Quote, aides privately conceded that the alleged Chinese phone calls Trump described didn't happen the way he said they did. Instead, two officials said Trump was eager to project optimism that might boost markets. Oh, that's why he told those lies about the Chinese government phone calls. I mean, this is White House officials admitting that the president told the public, told us, that the Chinese government had called his administration to reopen trade talks, when in fact that had not happened. And he did it because he was hoping to boost the markets by telling that lie. The problem with that one is that lying to the public for the purpose of moving the markets, which is what Trump White House officials are admitting happened here, that's actually a crime. It's illegal to deliberately try to manipulate the markets. The Securities and Exchange Commission says that kind of behavior is against federal law. For the record, it's also a crime for a president or anyone to falsify a weather forecast, like, say, a hurricane tracking map, like he did today when he held up this doctored map in the Oval Office. As meteorologist Matthew Cappucci at the Washington Post points out today, meteorologists Matthew Cappucci and Andrew Friedman point out at the Washington Post today, quote, per 18 U.S. Code Section 2074, whoever knowingly issues or publishes any counterfeit weather forecast or warning of weather conditions, falsely representing such forecast or warning to have been issued or published by the Weather Bureau, the U.S. Signal Service, or other brand of government service, shall be fined under this title or imprisoned by imprisoned not more than 90 days or both. You have to pay a fine for that or go to prison for 90 days or both. I should say the modern iteration of both of those government weather services mentioned in that statute would include the National Weather Service, would include the National Hurricane Center, which was in fact the originator of the tracking map the president put on display in the Oval Office today, with what was reportedly his own added false drawing that was scribbled into the corner to make it look like the hurricane was going somewhere that it wasn't. And what this appears to be about is the president trying to backfill for a weird lie that he's been telling about this hurricane. While the president was not in Poland, while he was instead having his golfing weekend, he started tweeting this weekend and saying aloud this weekend that the great state of Alabama was in the path of Hurricane Dorian. Alabama will most likely be hit much harder than anticipated. He tweeted it. He said it on camera a couple times. Now, the National Weather Service, to their credit, they were Johnny on the spot with their rebuttal. Within 20 minutes of the president first making these weird claims that Alabama was going to get hit by this hurricane, it's not going to get hit by this hurricane. The National Weather Service office in Birmingham, Alabama, was clarifying that what the president was saying was absolutely not true. Alabama will not see any impacts from Dorian. We repeat, no impacts from Hurricane Dorian will be felt across Alabama. The system will remain too far east. I mean, the only reason the National Weather Service had to send that out was because of the false information, to the contrary, that was inexplicably being promulgated by the president. And why was he doing that? Who knows why the president was lying about Alabama being in the path of the hurricane? But he has done so repeatedly, and that has now apparently led up to this odd display of this falsified National Weather Service map today in the Oval Office at what the White House billed as the president's hurricane update. And what that means in practical terms is that Americans now need to debunk the president of the United States in order to find real National Weather Service tracks of the hurricane, while the hurricane literally bears down on the eastern seaboard of the United States. And it's all self-inflicted and inexplicable, and in some cases, technically illegal. I mean, if the National Weather Service persists in putting out real information that doesn't retroactively back up false things the president has said about this hurricane, is he going to fire them? Is he going to retaliate against them? Is he going to denounce the Weather Service as the deep state? I think he'll tell Bill Barr that he should prosecute them for something. Think Bill Barr will? I mean, it's insane, but we don't have any way to make sense of this. Nothing like this has ever happened before. I mean, you'd kind of think that, like, the weather is a thing that might be a great leveler in terms of the facts. A whole bunch of the Democratic presidential candidates have put out their climate plans, or put out new iterations of their climate plans in the past few days. Candidates including Cory Booker and Pete Buttigieg and Kamala Harris. Elizabeth Warren has just announced that she's adopting Jay Inslee's climate plan. Jay Inslee pronounced himself delighted that she's taking it, since he said when he dropped out of the presidential race that he considered his plan to be an open source document, and he hoped other candidates would, in fact, run on it. The Democrats are trying to compete with this president. They're trying to say Donald Trump should be a one-term president in part because of his handling of climate. In terms of the current administration's climate plans, I mean, you have to read them not through what they say, but what they do. Today, for example, we learned that the Trump administration is rolling back efficiency standards on light bulbs, standards that were first promulgated under the George W. Bush administration. And light bulbs kind of sounds like no big deal, I know, but the rule that the Trump administration is rolling back today was both working and it was kind of a big deal. Quote, the rule change announced today by the Trump administration is expected to increase U.S. electricity use by 80 billion kilowatt hours over the course of a year, roughly the amount of electricity needed to power all the households in Pennsylvania and New Jersey. Getting rid of that rule as of today. Also today, the Washington Post reporting that, quote, the top interior official who pushed to expand drilling in Alaska will now join an oil company drilling in Alaska. This is called drilling the swamp, not draining it. The Washington Post reporting today that the Trump Interior Department official, who is the guy in charge of overseeing oil and gas drilling on federal lands, is now joining a foreign oil company that's expanding its drilling operations on Alaska's North Slope. Before he left the Interior Department, this is the guy who oversaw preparations to hold lease sales in parts of Alaska that would open those parts of Alaska up to being drilled for oil by private companies. Now that official who just did that work in the Trump administration is going to work for one of those companies that's drilling in Alaska. So that's what the Trump administration is actually doing in terms of climate policy. I mean, no matter what it is that they're saying, you can see evidence of what it is that they're doing. But as this storm bears down on the southeastern United States, the policies and the actions of this administration are one thing. The random nonsense words from the president and the White House on this or any other issue, that's usually quite another thing altogether. And in most cases, it's worth ignoring and just watching what they do rather than what they say. But now, I mean, as of tonight, we are in a new, I repeat, new situation in which the president's sort of daily nonsense has crossed over into behavior in the midst of a literal emergency. The president putting on display a map that appears to deliberately misinform the public about what's going on at a time when this potentially quite deadly thing is roaring on shore.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.